Hello and welcome to the program. I am Sren. I believe that this following program must be considered when attempting to teach our young ones. From before a primary school level, and how to think and express themselves. It goes for everybody. I also feel, just like many educators would, that an observable difference with today's generation is quite disturbing, as the young ones seem to be still unable to formulate their thoughts or struggling to think, let alone to express themselves easily these days. We can blame all sorts of things, particularly that is social media, it's easier, or usage of electronic devices to communicate with. But I would suggest, personally, that instead of considering those elements as the culprit for the young becoming unable to think and expressing themselves properly, or even slowing down with their educational process and degrading their intelligence, can be overcome if the parents and the educators would be teaching them on a worldwide scale how to think and become creative, and how to express themselves first, long before teaching them any language skills. Although the language skills are important, but expression of oneself, one's own thoughts and feelings are even more important. Of course, this will depend on what kind of future we all want. Man has been designed and designated as a social animal, a speaking animal, and tool-using animal. We can also describe him as a thinking animal, for he is, among all other living creatures, has evolved a reasoning power and a mind that is highly developed and enabled him to master his environment instead of remaining a slave to it. The science of psychology reminds us that emotion still plays a large part in our lives. One can see it clearly that man still sticks to doctrines and ideas which the human reason would condemn as unowned or not acceptable, or keep going to venerate institutions with which we have long since been broken off intellectually. It is true that even the most rational of us might give way to the urge of one or another of those primitive instincts, which dwell deep down in our nature, still controlling our lives. Even a philosopher may fall a victim to a pair of blue eyes, blonde hair. The most level-headed person may be worked up to a frenzy by the influence of certain propaganda, as it was once. The politicians, advertisers, the representatives of variety of interests have all, at one time or another, attempted to exploit man's credulity, and that is known as being true in this current age. For humans of today know much more about the workings of the mind. We can discover it in the human history that every time a new scientific discovery has been made, it was charged, so it remained with possibilities for the promotion over the whole of humanity, wanting those who have turned it to less worthy ends and results, resulting in the enslavement of humanity. Even the science of psychology can be said suffering the same fate today. Ever more subtle means being employed to perpetuate dangerous ideas, to persuade people that they are not in error, but supposedly leading into the truth, as in the case of certain cults and religious ideals of today. The information made available to us by the exercise of thought, and the reason is utilized to kill the free exercise of thought and reason of today, believe it or not. In olden days, people enslaved the bodies of their fellow men. They also enslaved the minds in all servitude, and so the intellect has become the most downgrading one, since it robbed man of the very attribute which is the chief glory of his humanity. If you desire to have an example of this absurdity, look no further than organizations such as Jehovah's Witnesses, spread all around the world. What then is the moral of all this, you might ask? It is our duty to cultivate our powers of thought and reasoning so that we may resist seductive influences and be able to differentiate the right from the wrong, the good from the bad, the sound from the unsound, the true from the spacious. H.G. Wells, in his History of the World, reminds us, as also by Aldous Huxley, in his book Ends and Means, that the faculty of rational thinking, the ability to observe and relate facts, and to reflect upon their value, is a comparatively new development in the story of existence. Indeed, this goes back a few thousand years, out of the many millions of years as the scientists have traced the existence of life on this planet Earth. Because of this emergence, it is still very imperfect and filtering, so that in times of stress or excitement, humans tend to throw it off altogether and give pleasure to those more primitive instincts and impulses, which still have a strong hold over them. You can see this with the human instinct of conducting their wars and conflicts. Just like a little infant trying to walk and becoming excited about something that has attracted his attention. Indeed, man is only an animal with a rational innocence, that he is capable of reasoning if he desires so. Not that his life is continuously governed by reason. So is a comparatively late emergence in the evolutionary process of mankind. It certainly is not by accident that man has developed the power of thought, and having developed it, he, rather than having the irrational thoughts, has become the Lord of creation. Ultimately, it is thought, not violence, that rules the planet. There's a dictum which I'm sure you are familiar with. The pen is mightier than the sword. It is even given a voice when it was said, pointing to the unacknowledged legislators of the world. It truly is linked to the rest of the mysterious universe in which he, the man, lives and moves. In fact, he is a major part of it, therefore subject to its laws physically and morally. I'm not sure if you are familiar with Sir James Jeans. In his The Mysterious Universe, he writes, "Not, of course, our individual minds, but the mind in which the atoms of which our individual minds have grown exist as thoughts. The universe shows evidence or designing and controlling power that has something in common with our own individual minds. The tendency to think in the way which, for want or a better word, we can describe it as mathematical. By looking at it this way, the story of evolution starts to look more and more like the story of the slow emergence of man in the animated world of mind. Or, to put it in another way, the ever-increasing expression in the individual creature of the ultimate universal reality. When observing the potentiality of mind in the amoeba, just as there is the potentiality of the flower in the seed, each step forward that evolution took in the case of a particular species was a step towards a further expression of the mind. Many species developed different attributes, but it was the species that developed the mind that became the dominant one, mastering its own destiny, and so far as it was able to adapt its environment to itself, instead of being under the necessity, as all other species still were, of adapting itself to its environment. It was a fuller and more complete expression of the purpose of existence. The mind began to function as thought, and thought is one of the essentials of personality. By judging of higher and lower types of men, we can adopt as our criterion the extent to which he has achieved personality, and the extent to which he manifests mind and which is able to think, will, and act intelligently. We indeed implied that mind and the power of thought have a value which other characteristics, in the physical sense, strength and fleet, have not. It appears that if humans are to achieve a fuller personality and fulfill the purpose of existence, they should seek first to think clearly and truly. Modern knowledge of our days can teach us that our universe is an order to one that is grounded in certain laws, which are eternal and immutable, therefore be depended upon to act consistently and uniformly. This is only another aspect of the conception of mind as the ultimate reality. 2 and 2 always made 4 and always will. The principles of Archimedes, the theory of Pythagoras, and formula for determining the mining area of the circle, as they were first formulated, remain still true today. And when a truth is once discovered, it remains true for always, and as it was actually equally true before it was even discovered. Newton did not create the principle of gravity. He only discovered and formulated it. If nature's laws varied from age to age instead of remaining constant, all scientific inquiry and all thought would be impossible. Reasoning is only valid because the universe itself is rational, and the right thinking is the attempt to apply to every question by which we are confronted those principles upon which we conceive the universe itself to be founded. And every phenomenon which can possibly come within our ken, a part of that universe, and must therefore subject to its laws. This notion leads to the question of freedom of thought. It is a subject upon which there has been much unintelligent talk. If we can stop to think for a brief moment, we shall see that freedom implies some kind of authority. For example, there could be no freedom in a community where everyone did just as he or she liked, irrespective of the probable end result or consequences to other people. The enjoyment of one's own rights and desires must therefore be restrained or regulated by due consideration and respect for the rights and desires of others, because we are not alone. Naturally, in a perfect society, there would be no need for coercive laws to enforce this. But it does not mean that the individual would be subject to no authority. That authority would certainly be inward, not external at all. Likewise, the freedom of thought does not mean irresponsibility of thought. The free thinker has his authorities in his reasoning and his conscience, which he considers of higher validity. He learned everything external, whether it is at a church, state, convention, or even tradition. Freedom of thought means the right to place upon facts whatever interpretation one feels, the most rational one, and if our thinking is to be directed right into this fact, it must be clearly grasped and understood. It does not mean that we must never accept convention or even tradition. What it means is that we must only accept it if it has been tested and approved by our reason. In matters intellectually, reason is the ultimate court of appeal. Even the faith and the last resort must be grounded upon reason. For we can only accept a proposition which is not immediately demonstrable. If we feel that it is reasonable to do so, there are cases where it is more reasonable for us to accept the opinion of another, who might be better qualified to judge than we are. than to rely upon our own conclusions, which are perhaps thrown from insufficient facts. But that is a subject matter for another time. There are two different methods of reasoning: the method of the deduction and of induction. Deductive reasoning works from the general to the particular. Inductive from the particular to the general. For instance, if we want to calculate the length of the diagonal or rectangle whose adjacent sides are 3 inches and 4 inches respectively, the diagonal in question will form the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle, the other two sides of which are of measurements just as deemed. In the case of every right-angled triangle, the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides. Hence, the diagonal of this particular rectangle will measure 5 inches. This is only an example of selective reasoning. So, we would start with a proposition which has been established as universally true. We need to assure ourselves, yet the case we have to deal with is one of which this proposition may legitimately be applied. Therefore, we applied, and from certain known facts, we concluded that which was previously unknown. However, we have confidence in this method of reasoning and its conclusions because, as it has been stated before, we know that the universe is a rational and its law constant, and that what was true in the time of Pythagoras is equally true today. We need to accept this or cease thinking and reasoning altogether. The inductive method of reasoning is the opposite of this. Imagine a child is taken ill after consuming some kind of food for tea. There may be some connection between his illness and that food, but it is not at all certain. Shortly afterwards, another person becomes ill in the same way, and it transpires that he also has eaten the same food. This may be a coincidence, but when a third and a fourth case are reported, it will seem that the possibility of coincidence must be ruled out. And if the reason of the cases amount to 10 or a dozen, it is fairly safe for one to conclude that there is a definite connection between the food and the illness. This conclusion is strengthened if it is established that in every case the food items were of the same brand or bought at the same shop. This is only an example of inductive reasoning. The method by which certain facts are exempt and had a significance or a meaning is read into them. Actually, inductive reasoning precedes deductive. Before Pythagoras could formulate his theory with any certainty, he had to examine a large number of triangles. So, the principle which finally propounded was the result of inductive thinking. But having established it, he had provided for his successors basis for deductive thinking. Likewise, a doctor deduces an illness from the symptoms which he observes. But this is only possible because of the inductive methods of earlier medical science he previously learned about. The great danger in inductive thinking is that one is often apt to argue on insufficient cases. How many cases are the requisite before one can safely draw? Conclusions will vary with the nature of the question under consideration. With the food, for example, a relatively small number would suffice. But if one wants to know whether or not it is a fact that the majority of certain people are mean, it would clearly be unwarranted to base our judgment on a mere 10 or a dozen cases. More of this matter we will discuss a little later. And so, I will be meeting you again by the next episode. Until then, I wish you a lot of good time. Smile and be happy. And thank you for watching. And thank you for being there.